All right. Hello, everyone. And thank you all so much for coming. It means the world to all of us. My name is Olivia, and I'm a bookseller and member of the events team here at Belmont Books. For those of you who don't know, Belmont Books is an independently owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts, and we've been bringing books to the community since 2016. Before we begin, I'd like to let you guys know that we have a number of excellent events coming up. Tomorrow night, we are joined by Kristen Bear in conversation with Virginia Pye about Kristen's new book, Agatha Arch is Afraid of Everything. And next week on Tuesday, November 24th, Jan Ellisberg, Nancy Thorndike Greenspan, and Rachel Barenbaum are going to talk about their books, Hannah's War, Atomic Spy, and A Bend in the Stars. You can register for these and all of our other events at belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's books, Rocket Fantastic and Arrow. So just a reminder to everyone, please keep your audio off and your video as well. Any questions, please put in the chat. I will be fielding them, and I will relay as many to Maya and Gabby as possible after. I am so excited to introduce to you guys Maya Phillips and Gabrielle Calvocoressi. Gabby is the author of Apocalyptic Swing, The Last Time I Saw Amelia Earhart, and Rocket Fantastic. She is Associate Professor and Walker Piercy Fellow in Poetry at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an editor-at-large for the LA Review of Books. Maya is the author of the debut poetry collection, Eru, published by Fourway in 2019, and the recipient of a Hodder Grant from Princeton's Lewis Center for the Arts. Her second book, Nerd, on navigating heroes, magic, and fandom in the 21st century, is forthcoming in summer 2022, if we all survive that long. And Maya currently works at the New York Times and as a freelance writer. She lives in Brooklyn. And with that, I'll turn it over to our lovely readers. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Hey, Gabby, are you
I'm not being allowed to unmute. Oh, there we are. Okay, good. I kept trying and then it was like, no. And I was like, I too only want to hear from Maya, but come on.
No, you will not be stopped. We will not mute you. This is your right.
Oh my gosh. May I ask something though of the group? Would people be willing to just even for a second to turn their cameras on and just maybe like wave or something? People can say like, no, I'm not doing that. But do you sometimes feel like in this Zoom world, Maya, like when it's all these different, there's just all these beautiful people. Hi.
Look at you all. You're great.
You're great. This is my favorite moment is Zoom makes us all like little stars, like coming into the galaxy. Thank you. Everyone can go off again, but I wanted to say hi. Hey, Maya, how are you?
I'm great. Excited to read with you. I mean, should we just get into it with some poems? Like,
yeah, we should totally get into it. And everyone, I just want to say, like, we're just gonna be having conversation and reading and doing all this. And so, Maya, what would it mean for you to get into it with some poems right now?
Well, I'd prefer, I mean, is it totally a dick move to just like have you start and I'll be like, you set the pace?
No, not at all.
Cool.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to see everyone. And I do want to say thank you so much to Belmont Books. Last time I was here was like a year ago, and my family came from like Massachusetts and Connecticut, and we ate at an Italian restaurant across the street from Belmont Books, and it was this beautiful crowd, and it was just great. And like, who knew this is where we would be now? But like, we're still in a beautiful crowd at Belmont Books, so that's great. And so I want to thank you all so much, and I absolutely just want to say it's the pleasure of my life to get to read and talk with Maya Phillips, who I first met at Warren Wilson College. It's such a weird, in their MFA program for writers, such a weird thing to say one is one student, because I was also Maya's student during that time tremendously. And just, I'm going to read from my third book, Rocket Fantastic. And I was like really just finishing that book during that time with Maya. And I could not have really finished it without our conversations. And so that's like something that's really important to me. But I thought, like, if it's okay with folks, the first I read in Brookline on Sunday, and I've been giving myself the gift of reading Lucille Clifton every single day. I just want to hold this book up and just say, I was saying in Brookline that, and Maya, I want to ask you about this too later, but like those writers that you first experience, like when you're in college or high school, who sort of set you on a path, but who you just keep meeting and who keep teaching you. And Lucille Clifton is one of those people for me. And just like, as I'm reading through this book, I'm going to read Lucille Clifton for 365 days. I mean, I'll read her for the rest of my life, but every day for 365 days, because I'm going to teach this class next year called Lucille Clifton. I'm not teaching it. I'm just like having the pleasure of being in the presence of Lucille Clifton's poems. But anyway, I realize now that Lucille Clifton really helped me become a poet. This is called Mulberry Fields, which was a poem. Do you know this poem, Maya? Mulberry Fields?
I don't think I do.
I didn't know it either. Like, are there other people in the room who know Mulberry Fields? Feel free to put it in the chat. But like, I knew all these other poems, but then this poem showed up, and it's beautiful. So I want to start the night with Lucille Clifton. Mulberry Fields. They thought the field was wasting, and so they gathered the marker rocks and stones and piled them into a barn. They say that the rocks were shaped, some of them scratched with triangles and other forms. They must have been trying to invent some new language. They say the rocks went to build that wall there, guarding the manor, and some few were used for the state house. Crops refused to grow. I say the stones marked an old tongue, and it was called eternity and pointed toward the river. I say that after that collection, no pillow in the big house dreamed. I say that somewhere under here molders one called Alice, whose great-grandson is old now too and refuses to talk about slavery. I say that at the master's table only one plate is set for supper. I say no seed can flourish on this ground, once planted, then forsaken. Wild berries warm in a field of bones. Bloom how you must, I say. I don't know if you can see, but this poem, like there's all this like open breath space like down the center. And I realized like I must have read this book when I was like, it's so much like a kind of syntax that I work with in a certain part of my third book. I'm like, I bet you anything that like, and also that I say, it's so much like her amazing poem, If I Should. Anyway, I wanted to read that first because I've been thinking a lot about students and teachers and how we keep being taught. And then maybe I'll just read one poem of my own. And then I'm going to ask Maya, will you read, Maya? And I'm going to read the first poem in this book, and it's called Shave, which for some reason like seems related. I don't know. Shave. Like the buck I am, I turn my head side to side. I hear the leaves rustle. I shake my head a little, and birds reel round the forest. I am no branch. My head turns to the side. I see out my side eye. The deep pool of the eye sees itself pool in the mirror. I oil myself till I am all a lather. My chest heaves out, so my full heart can abandon the rib stockade. Where the bullet would go if the hunter were a good shot, that's where I place the razor. I make my skin taut. I pull my own neck back, and to the side I come for myself. Yes, I was a lady once, but now I take the blade and move it slowly past the jugular, up the ridge of my chin where the short hairs glisten. I was once ashamed. It was a thing I did in private. My own self, my quarry, no more. Look how the doe comes round, and also the doves, and also the wolf who lets me pass. The fox offers me the squirrel's hide to buff myself to shining. There is no such thing except the smoothness of my face. Yeah, it's good to like shave your face with a Mach 3 razor if like you were raised female, and then all of a sudden you go into CVS and you're like, can I please have that razor? But I also think about that Lucille Clifton when I read that poem, and I think that's what it is I learned from Clifton that I didn't learn how to do for a really long time, is that I say, if I should, and there's a certain like movement in that poem. That's what I'm thinking about. Maya, hi.
Hey. Oh man. What should I go for now? Wow.
Anything in that book of yours or anything new you're working on, it's going to be exactly the place to go.
I'm just thinking about what you're talking about with like repetition and like changing through the poem, because I think we talked about that when I was studying with you.
Yes.
And I'm gonna read this weird poem that I don't usually read as much because it's kind of difficult to read and the syntax is funky, and it has some of that repetition. But this is my poem, Say. And for you all following along at home, this is, it reads almost like a multiple choice, like a Mad Libs type situation where there are, you can see that. There are like slashes and parentheses, and it's like, I'll pause and give each option for how the sentence could continue. But this is Say. Today he says he's going to the store for some snacks, going fishing, going to his mother's, going to his friends, going around the block, and my mother, I, say, more? Again? For how long? For how long? For how long? For what? Where? Where are you going? Now? Again? And when the stove is left on, the windows are left broken, the door is left unlocked, the car is totaled, the fence falls in the storm, the electricity goes out, the heat goes out, he goes out. My mother says, again? For how long? And he says, only for a second. I will fix it. I was coming right back. An accident. I will fix it. I will fix it. I will fix it. I will fix it. And everything is fixed. Everything is broken. Everything is the same as before. And we say everything, nothing at all. And we are resolved, unanswerable to each other. And we are distant, furious, anxious, afraid. And we are family, strangers. Me, my mother, and who undoes, is undone, who is at the store, fishing, at his mother's, at a friend's, around the block. And in the end, after him, the house, all of us, I cannot say, I wore an old dress to the funeral. I almost didn't take the day off work. I didn't cry until I said the words out loud. I signed the papers. I deposited the checks. I worried about my shoes getting wet in the rain. I laughed at the reception. I slept soundly that night after it was all over. I'm saying, here we are, though it's over. And I tell him, or don't say, but climb out of the question. Have you been well? How's the weather where you're staying? Where'd you go? How'd you get there? When will you be back? Oh, you're muted again, Gabby.
Oh, I'm unmuted. But also I would have been muted in just like whoa. I've never heard, like, I'm trying to remember if I was at your thesis reading, because I don't know that I was there. Was I there?
I was trying to remember that a few minutes ago too. I don't remember you being there. Maybe you had to.
I must have not been teaching that term. And so I don't think I've heard these poems like read aloud. Like I haven't heard you read aloud. And so it's like, I'm also just like, my brain is exploding. It's so, I mean, it's so staggering. And I'm wondering, like, would you talk a little bit about, would you talk about the act of making this book? And I would really be interested if just like you would talk about like this poem in particular and these beautiful spaces of openness that both like let the ghosts in and out, let grief in and out, and also just like let kind of pragmatic everyday life come through too. Your work is so layered.
This is so flattering. Can you just like follow me around and just like power me through my day? Because I need that.
Yeah, I'm pleased to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think it was during the program at some point that I really kind of fell in love with those kinds of spaces in poems. And especially just thinking about I'm not going to do the whole like the speaker, because obviously this is very mostly autobiographical, but like in my family, when I was growing up, there was a lot of silences.
Yes.
With our temperaments, we were very kind of stubborn and like very cold when we all got mad. And so there would be these periods where like everyone goes off to their separate rooms. And I just feel like, and as an introverted person, like I love silence. I find there's something safe in silence. But then thinking back to my childhood, there's something also threatening in it. And I love the ways that silence can be that dynamic, those spaces that can hold all of that like you're saying, it can hold the grief that I was feeling about my father, but also all the other complicated feelings in there. And it can like hold all of our funny temperaments, and it can hold joy, and it can hold hope and imagination. And that's, I think, wonderful. And like allowing that to kind of overtake my syntax and lead me through the poem, I think, and giving it the space. I think that was really, I love doing that when I can in poems. And I mean, I think that's something you've used too, right? Like you've used breath and space as a way to talk about identity and self, which also super fascinating. If you want to talk some more about that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like when you look at me, I'm such like, I literally am such a like wasp. Like look at I'm getting so red because I'm getting so excited. Like it's literally, my body doesn't even know how to process this. So I do like what all wasps do, which is I become like this giant red globe. But anyway, but it's what you're talking about is so exciting to me, Maya, because I do have to say, like, Warren Wilson is extraordinary, and I've worked with so many extraordinary people, and it's interesting how different people you work with touch you in different ways. And I would say you, and also, and I definitely want to give a super shout out tonight to Tommy Blount, who it's the National Book Awards tonight. You, Tommy Blount, Jenny Johnson, I think of as three writers who I worked with and learned so much from at Warren Wilson, who I think, yes, like this idea of what silence could hold, what silence does hold, and what we don't want it to hold, but it insists on holding, and maybe holds us back and also pushes us forward, is something that is very, very interesting to me. I was thinking as you were talking about this, that I also grew up in a house where there was a lot of silence, and there was a part of it, I think, is the Puritan condition. And the other part of it, which has to do with certain kinds of self-loathing and just ideas of behavior. but also like in my house, my mother was very mentally ill, and I didn't live with her, but her illness was something that was ever present, but that nobody talked about. And when she took her life, I guess I should say trigger warning, there may be times through this evening where I talk about suicidality and suicide and stuff like that. There was also like this huge silence. Um, and and so so much of my poetics came from like being in a house where there were all these silences that were so full. I don't know if this makes sense to you, Maya, but I always think like I lived in a kind of house where I became an amazing like weather person. Like I was like a great emotional meteorologist because like it was silent, but you had to be able to like feel the storm in the silence or like how it was like feeling. And so I think there's also a way in my poems that there's a certain kind of weather that can happen in the silences, or they can be nuanced in various ways, because silence was a place that was like could be frightening, could be very sad, could also be a place of like deepest privacy and fantasy, you know, because
Mhm.
also as people weren't speaking, I was imagining all kinds of different embodiment for myself. And um, so it is something that plays into my work a lot. And I also think about it a lot in terms of the closet and like the various kinds of closets I lived in, and how the closet is like on one place on hand, like a really repressive place. But on the other hand, like I used to like bring all my blankets into the closet and sit in there for hours while people lived their crazy lives and like imagine an entirely different identity for myself. So um yeah, these dual silences. Maybe I'll read, you have inspired me so much, maybe I'll read, there's this thing that happens in this book where there I have just never lived within one pronoun comfortably, and very often I have imagined a different vessel for myself. Sometimes it's male, sometimes it's like something entirely different. We could have an entirely interesting conversation about things like AI and stuff like that, but um so in this book there are poems in which there is no gendered pronoun, it's a symbol and there's kind of a sound. So I'll read this because it reminds me of your poem, kind of like I'm so inspired by you. It's huge, standing there in the woods where I didn't even see who's at first. Doesn't know I'm looking. Moves a little bit and kicks the ground. I was walking by myself as the sun set. I kept going in deeper to the greenest spot until I found a clearing. Was the clearing. Took the clearing up and stood there still and watched me till I saw whose. I saw whose shoulders first and then whose neck I think was so golden in the sun. I didn't know what was, and I thought the branches were whose horns. I thought was an 8-point stag, and how whose chest made a kind of giant heart out of me, out of my eyes looking. And let me look, stood there in the green, not moving. I thought whose horns were leaves. I saw 8 branches coming from whose head didn't stop my looking, didn't run away. I watched the whole of whose. I saw whose arms and legs and the taper of whose legs. Let me watch whose for maybe hours, but really moments, like a gift. Like when you're almost home and smell them cooking supper, but you're still outside and could just turn back around. We stood like that together. Let me touch the whole of whose, every rise and muscle. Let me rest on the hollow of whose neck and breathe it in for 4 whole breaths. Said my name, or shook whose head inside the leaves and sigh and let the light come into us. Let the light hold us for a while. I was thinking about that because I was thinking, Maya, about like ghosts and like invitations from an other side. And that was something I think about a lot in your poems, because that was one of the things I was so blown away by when we first like started working together, was like that veil. It's not even like a veil in your poems. It's just like the world, like how worlds move back and forth with each other.
Yeah. Can I just say, I love that poem.
Thank you.
I feel like I've heard you read it before, and I've read it a few times on the page, but it is such an experience to hear you read it out loud, because what really struck me this time that maybe didn't strike me immediately because I'm probably too dense, but like it's the way that line near the end where you talk about the four breaths and then you transform, like there's some kind of transformation that keeps happening in your poems. And this is, of course, in general, I feel like you have a lot of transformations, but then in particular, in terms of your use of your kind of pushing back against the idea of pronouns and like identity, and that there's something protean about that, which I love. So let me, oh, and something you said earlier about being kind of like a weather person in your home.
Yeah.
This made me think of, I have a short poem that made me think of that. And then
Here.
I'm going to read another short poem that I've been thinking about with transformation and ghosts. So this is a kind of temperament. We're a stormy kind of people. My father reigned for days after his funeral. We each of us tempest our old world rage. In another age, we'd have been gods, but here we are in our mortgaged homes, rented apartments, in our leased cars, in our morning commutes. Here we are in our everyday spite and sorrow, in our lifetimes of fury. All are Sturm and Drang and nothing to show for it. We're human even on the worst days. When it rains, it pours, and we're caught in it too.
We're human even on the worst days.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'll read another short one that I tend to like, but I don't know. I feel like I don't read it as much either. Okay. This is, sometimes my father is a roaming hunger, which is to say, sometimes he's the locust swarming the front door, or the stray scratching at the window at night. He is what looks for its fill, the empty chamber of evening. My father, who drinks the grit at the bottom of each glass, devours every morsel and might. Untidy he is. We are, in hosting the remnants, feasting the spoiled. When he is the appetite that outlives him, my father eats himself out of the grave, dines on the neighborhood, chews our house down to its bones.
Like you have real ghosts in your poem. Like that does that make sense? Like it's like one of I have always loved this, and then I want to read a locust. I have a locust ghosty poem.
Oh, do you? You have to read it.
I do. But this is something that I think is really, really interesting about what you do. And I think it's one of the things that's the ghosts in your poem, like, or the beings from the other side, the father, however, and I would be interested to know if you think of them as think of like the father as a ghost or as like one of the things I'm really interested in is like in your book, like I don't know when I've read a book where this idea of myth and the way sort of beings from other like veils and spaces come into contact with the living world is done like, I'm not being articulate about this. It is done so much like it is actually done in Greek myth. And that is really interesting. Like, if that makes sense. And I'd be interested to also think about your life in theater and like, if there's something about that too. I'm not being clear, but I'm very interested in that. What I love is like, the father, like eating it's not good or bad, right? It's just like a being in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like not scary, not just like, this is what this being is doing. Right. I love that. And when things know they're dead and when they don't. Let me see if I can I never read this poem and I don't know why, but I think maybe because it scares me a little bit.
Ooh, I love scary stuff.
Yeah, and like I don't even know, I don't think the poem is scary to a reader, but there's a lot going on in this poem that I actually kind of like Do you have poems that you write that you think could actually bring a ghost?
Oh my gosh. No, I think I'm not. I don't think I'm doing it right.
No, you're doing it right. But like sometimes I have a poem like where I'm a little bit like, is my grandmother just gonna step out of the page and like what is that gonna be? Not because the poem is so good, but because she's gonna be like, you called? If that makes sense.
Yes. I feel like maybe I have a sense of being so in control of that.
Mhm.
Like, especially with the book I wrote, I'm like, no, I am bringing forth my father for this specific reason. I am being the the
Yeah.
architect here. So that's a completely different mindset. I'm controlling this world. So the ghosts will come when I say they come.
Right. Whereas like I call for the ghosts and call for the ghosts and they like literally ghost me and they won't come. And then I'm like, and then they're like, oh, hello. But it's also, it's interesting you say that like having that power and also that control, but also that like, that willingness, because one of the things when my mother took her life, I didn't sleep. I really didn't sleep for 3 months. I began hallucinating and all these things. I was 13 because I was so scared that her ghost was going to come. And I was so scared like that she was going to like come visit that I would not let myself go to sleep. So it's very interesting when you talk about, yeah. Anyway, in a landscape of perpetual springtime, if I remember the locust, it's not because I was there. If I remember the deer with her tongue in my hand, well, it's just because I heard a song about it once. Oh, you say the deer was in the forest by the glade and I was just come up from the water. How strange. I could have sworn I was at the drive-in watching Cherry Valance tell Pony Boy he didn't see her at all. Wealth. It was a locust I had once, chariots and gardens so deep you couldn't even see the pillars holding up the house. Once my grandmother made a necklace out of locusts without having to kill a single one. Now that's what I call being rich. She walked through the garden and I heard it singing. She said, just listen. And I heard the world spin round her and rise up. I barely remember it, and it's all I ever think about. This was in the season of masturbation in the afternoon. This was in the age of the guiding light, which is to say, pure decadence. One by one, the locusts lined up and snapped their brass jaws open, a battalion of soldiers unbuttoning their greatcoats and baring their hearts. Oh, it was beautiful. No metaphor will do. My grandmother taking one of the hairs from the top of my scalp and stringing it through. So slowly, I could see the locust's flanks heave in and out, the hair going in deeper until she pulled it out the locust's backside with her index finger and her thumb, and moved on to the next one. Privilege. She brought the deer up. They couldn't believe their eyes. And when I said I wanted it, I wanted the chain of locusts around my throat, she came toward me through the garden. The mayflies rose up from the pools and made of themselves her crown. How am I supposed to understand this economy when my grandmother made of the deer a retinue, when I've beheld locust legs swimming toward me as she pulled the necklace taut and laid it on my neck? I don't know about those locusts.
Wow, that was an intense locust experience. It felt like we're talking about mythology. Like that felt like its own mythology in
Right?
that, yeah.
I had a dream about it. I had a dream. Do you dream about the dead?
Yes, all the time.
Yeah. So and when you dream about the dead, people right now are like, what is happening here? But I have a question. When you dream about the dead, do they know they're dead? Or does it depend?
Uh Usually not. Usually they're just wandering around being regular people.
Yeah. So like sometimes when I dream about my grandparents, sometimes I think that they know they're dead, and sometimes I think I'm going to have to be the one to tell them. It doesn't seem to bother them either way. They like roam around. I always only dream of them in their house, and their house is basically the underworld. Like now, and at the end of almost every dream, they ask me if I really want to go, like if I really want to leave.
Oh my gosh.
It's really intense. And there's like people sitting by the pool and all these people, and they always ask me, they're like, are you sure you want to go? And like, I had a dream though, where I was standing outside at my grandparents' house and my grandmother just started walking towards me with this like chain of like golden locusts, like humming, and just like put it around my neck. And then so it is a little mythological because it's like going.
Gabby.
I mean,
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, I feel like since the pandemic, I know this has happened with other people too, like having especially weird dreams. I've always had weird dreams, but like they've been bonkers.
yeah.
And pretty consistently ever since March, my father has shown up in many of my dreams, and he's always alive, just hanging out, doing what he did in his life. And so it's very odd. And then before he died, I had dreamt once or twice of his death. So that was also very bizarre. But
Yes.
I'm going to read a poem that made me think of just based on one of those dreams, actually, that I had. In which my mother and father meet for brunch after his death. They're in the cafe in the next town over, the cute one with the red awning, and she's trying to remember how she got here, in this cafe she's driven past but never been to, eating her spinach and goat cheese omelet, him, his French toast and home fries, only he's not eating, but saying he's sorry. And she thinks how strange it is when the words come out of the mouth of the waiter, saying, sorry, he forgot the fruit salad. It will just be a second. And out of the mouth of the woman joining to the table to their left, saying, sorry, she's late because of traffic. The parkway was a mess. And out of the mouths of the boys in the back booth, their faces sticky with syrup and jam, who had been speeding like trains around the tables before their mother told them to stop, to say, I'm sorry. And now my mother's done with her meal, and he's saying he's sorry like a beggar asking for food, only there is no one else here. Just the two of them and their silverware and plates and packets of salt and sugar and honey at the only table there is. And maybe this isn't a cafe or any place even real. Because when he says he's sorry again, the last time, she wonders how he speaks with his mouth sealed shut.
How do you do that? Like, how do you get, like, for people who are at any stage of their writing, and whether it's like writers who've influenced you or just like how it works in your practice, how do you get so many levels of experience into one poem? Like being just like ordering this meal and like what's happening on the parkway, and then also all these other levels. Was there someone were there writers that influenced you that like allowed all this to happen, or has it just always been the way the world has come into you?
I mean, that's a great question. I would have to, I'm sure there are writers who've done this for me, but I feel like I wasn't consciously aware that that's a thing I was doing. I mean, this might be the whole thing with theater, like you were talking about. Like, obviously, I'm a theater critic, and I guess I'm just very aware of characters and like the place people have in relationship to each other, and the differences in people's perception of the world, and what happens when those things clash, or what happens when they meld in like a kind of dreamlike way. And that's, I think, fascinating and interesting. And with me, again, feeling like this architect of the world, like I can kind of use those different experiences and have them be conflated or separated in various ways. And I think it just works in that kind of poem where we are in a kind of dream state where those boundaries are fluid. So that makes it so much fun. There's like a kind of ventriloquism happening throughout the poem, which happens in dreams.
Yes. And one of the things I was realizing, I don't know that I ever thought about this when for people who don't, Warren Wilson is really cool in that you work with like, I would as a teacher would work with 4, let's say, students over the course of the semester. And what that meant is that student, like Maya and I were just writing letters to each other for the course of like months and looking at poems together and reading and thinking together. And so it was really sacred. And I don't know if I ever used this word then, but I think about this a lot. Like when I read your work and when you're reading it aloud, which is the word traffic. There's like actually like a lot of really interesting traffic in your poems. And I really like the way like the living and the dead and the way like everything happens or is happening all at once feels actually to me like traffic isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. Traffic is just like lots of different things moving around each other and having to like figure out how to make their path and not stop each other up for a minute, but then like keep each other moving, which also seems to me something that probably theater is also something that to some extent maybe is one could think about that in terms of theater as well. Because I was thinking as you were reading, there's just so much traffic, there's so much going on, and yet like you're able to manage all of that. And that's really interesting to me.
I think that's also the fact of me being a New Yorker and
Yeah.
being in love with the city and having this constant awareness of all the things happening simultaneously and the lives that are crisscrossing. And speaking of traffic, I love the subway, and my dad was an MTA worker. So just, I like thinking about that kind of movement.
Yeah. I don't know why I never saw that happens in your poems so much. That like the poems in themselves are a form of public transit, but like the public transit is also like a spiritual transit and like a metaphorical transit. But actually, like I've never thought about, but I think that's true. I think that there's an entire transit system moving through all those poems.
Oh my gosh, Gabby, I missed you so much.
I miss you so much. Oh my gosh, it's really interesting. Hey, because I know it's about time for people to ask questions, but can we talk for a minute about what you are doing right now at the New York Times and your life with theater? Because I think this is really, really interesting. And I'm wondering, did you always watch plays? Like as you were coming through your world of poetry, is theater something that's also been sort of a through line for you? And what is it like going to see so many shows and having that media sort of moving through you all the time?
Well, I didn't have the same level of engagement with theater all my life like I have with poetry, because I read poetry like as a kid. So I feel like I wasn't able to, like, theater was a treat. Like we would go to Manhattan and see a show, but it was like mostly kind of like glitzy Broadway things. And it wasn't until I got to college where I started like engaging, I think, like with theater more seriously. And I was like, oh, this is something that, like poetry, I felt so comfortable kind of diving into it. And it was endlessly fascinating and enriching for me, in the way that like I love movies, I love TVs, I love, various other art forms, and I write about those too, but it's like I don't feel the same kind of life in it that I feel with theater. And it does, I feel like it gives me a very particular relationship to theater, just me being a poet, because I am so fascinated with the language. And like some people, like I know a lot of critics are, like some critics come at it from like a performance background, like they knew the acting classes and they know about direction or whatever. And I'm interested in those things too. But for me, theater is primarily, or like is first, a form of literature. And I read it and I experience it knowing that. And with the performance thing, I look at it also, having formerly been a slam poet, like I was used to being trained in how to perform my own work and like seeing other people perform and like seeing what works. And I guess that also informs how I critique theater. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I should be saying something more,
No, it's fascinating.
but
It's really, really interesting. And it's also like, I'm interested because what I think as I like watch, I mean, I think, I don't know if you want to talk about it or not. I think what you did with the two modes that Claudia Rankin, for instance, is communicating in was really, really important and really interesting. And what I also think is like, because I get a New York Times subscription and I get to like see your face, like I get to read you and I'm so excited. I always like make a little noise. I'm like, ah! But I also like, just as I've seen you as a poet, like coming into your voice and into a really like complicated, nuanced authority and just like real grace. I feel like I'm also seeing that like with when you're writing about theater. And I wonder if like it's also this issue, like, do you also feel like, does one find their voice in that way too? And do you find yourself kind of moving into different aspects of your brain, yourself, your way of looking? I don't know if that's clear.
yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to answer the question. I hope I'm
It was
understanding.
an unclear question.
Yeah, no, I think the question of like voice and authority is something that I've had to deal with, and I feel like I felt more comfortable like asserting my voice or my authority in poetry because it felt so just intrinsic to me. It was my internal landscape. So there's nothing to be, there's no real argument there, you know? I'm like, this is how it is. But when you go to critique another art form in this public forum, you know, it's not as easy as I can't just be like, well, you know, this is what I think and that's it. Like, this is like, I have to kind of build my argument. I have to, it's also like a persuasive style of writing.
Mhm.
In a way, poetry can too, but it feels more so like that for me for criticism.
Mhm.
And it's been really great for me to kind of play with the various registers and like play with diction and play with syntax and like sentence length and just see what is the most effective way for me to convey my thoughts on this piece of work, this piece of art. And I got part of that from poetry.
Yeah.
And just like the kind of meticulous attention that you're taught to have with poems, and not in a way that you're like necessarily over analyzing it, but like just kind of understanding the building blocks of the language that you're building. And I mean language in a way that's, you know, very literal. And I mean language as in like the kind of metaphorical language that you're using, whatever the language of the world is that you're
Yeah.
using within that poem.
Yeah. It's also like really interesting. And I know you have a show to get to tonight. So we're going to answer people's questions, but I would say it's also interesting because one of the things you do in your poems, which I think is really interesting, is your poems, like you step back, you step back in the poems very often and like look at the world coming toward you. Like there's a way in which in your theater criticism, I wonder if it's also the poems have taught you how to do that. The way of like stepping back and taking in the long view. And like, that is something I think about when I read your theater criticism is I'm like, oh, that's really similar to in the book, the kind of feeling of what like deep curiosity and also non-attachment feels like in the work is really interesting to me. Yeah, I'm into it. Hey, we have a bunch of questions.
We do. Thank you guys so much. It's
Maya, you rock.
such an honor
You
to
rock.
listen to you guys read. It's really just, I'm so glad to be here tonight. So we have a lot of questions from our very eager fans. A lot of them have to do with how are you guys managing your creativity right now? What's inspiring you? What's challenging about being creative in lockdown? What's pushing you to write? What are there certain inspirations?
I would say I'm having kind of a hard time writing right now. So I I'm part of it is I'm teaching a lot and doing, but as always, the thing that does inspire me, and maybe this is the way you and I are also similar, is just going for like super long walks. And I live in a neighborhood where I live in Old East Durham in North Carolina, and it is very much in some ways like the small town I grew up in terms of with my grandparents, where like you cannot have your headphones on because there is just an etiquette where there are a lot of older people, and like as you walk down the street, like people are going to ask you how you are, and you need to be able to say hello to them. And if you walk by, there are a lot of people like me moving into the neighborhood who have their headphones all the time and don't say hello to anyone. And I realized when my first time out, I had my headphones in, and then I was like, oh no, this is like where I grew up. Like I cannot have my headphones in. And so I took my headphones. And so all day long I chat with people and I learn things about people. And I also like the traffic of that a lot. And that I know is going to help me. It always ends up helping me with poems, just to let the world come in and be in conversation with like lots of different people and learn lots of different things.
My answer is going to be less interesting, but I have deadlines. So, I mean, with poetry, I haven't been able to focus on it as much. I've been kind of in and out during the pandemic, but like I'm writing a book and my day job is constant writing. So like it's good for me that I like to have that structure. And it's actually great that in a time, I'm sure I would have trouble writing poems if I was like actively doing that right now. But with journalism, it's a really easy thing. I'm like, I have a deadline. I have thoughts on this play. I have thoughts on this movie. Like that's what I'm going to focus my attention on. And I can also bring the world in that way. If I'm worried about what's happening in politics or what's happening in, all the trash fires of the world at the time, I can just, that's going to inform my criticism, as I think it should.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another question was, where did your writing journeys begin? And like, how did you find your voice as a young writer?
You want to go, Gabby, or should I?
You go.
Okay. I started writing when I was like a real youngin'. I wrote my first novel when I was 6, and I wrote my first poem when I was 8, and it was terrible. And yeah, I've been writing ever since then. And it's always a thing I went to when I was in school as a kid, and it was encouraged by my teachers, and I studied it in college. And then of course I went to the MFA program at Warren Wilson, where I studied with Gabby. And it's just been a constant. I feel like I had a very narrow view of poetry when I was a kid. I just read the old white dudes, all dead. And then I went to undergrad and I was like, oh, there are living poets who do different things. And they're not all just like form poems, and they're not all about, their sad, unrequited loves. But so that's been great. And in college too is where I discovered Poetry Slam. And that was really changed my relationship to the rhythms of my work and the kind of characters, because with performance, there's a lot of like kind of character monologues, there's a lot of character voices, and there's certainly a attention played to cadences and rhythm. So all of that influenced me. There we go.
Did you think of yourself as a writer when you were little? Like when you were writing that novel when you were little, you were like, I'm a writer.
Yeah, I've always thought of myself as a writer.
Yeah. I also, like when I always wrote. I grew up I grew up with my grandparents for a long time, and my grandfather was a lawyer, and I realized like it was really, really amazing for me, because what he would do is like on the days where there wasn't school and my grandmother wasn't around to take care of me, he would just take me to court. And we would get in the car, and he would, as we were driving, he would talk about the cases that day, because sometimes he was a probate judge, so we were going to court where he was going to be a judge, and some days but usually it was on the days when he was being a judge, and probate judge, and he would explain to me like what the cases were, what was going to happen. And then I was tiny, and he would put me in the back of the courtroom with like a giant legal pad and like a pencil, And he would be like, take notes on everything you hear and we'll talk about it at lunch. And like, so I would like sit there, you know, and I would like listen. And what he would say, which I think is like kind of the center of my poetics, is he said, everyone is going to be talking about the same event and they're all going to tell a different story. He said, so I want you to tell me all the different stories that you hear. And actually, like, again and again in my poems, that's what happens. Like everyone's looking at the same thing, but seeing it totally differently. And so we would do that. And then lunch would come, we'd go to some like big lawyer, like, you know, restaurant with the big banquettes. I'd sit there and like eat my burger and talk to him about and then we would go back to court for the second part of the day. And, I think that in some ways that's like really how I became a writer, because I was hearing stories, or people would come to the house and they would like be, you know, talking business with him, and I would sit under the table and like listen, take notes. So I was always writing stories and I was always writing. But then what happened was, you know, I lived also in this world of silences, and my mom took her life and nobody talked about it. I mean, I went to school the next day. Like I was sent to school the day after my mother killed herself. Like it was like, you know, and so I began writing in like a notebook. I didn't think of myself as having a journal. I wrote in a notebook, and I don't think I understood they were poems until I went to summer camp and I showed it to a counselor, and then he was like, "Oh, you're writing poems." And I was like, "Oh," like that felt very important. So I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm writing poems." And pretty quickly I was like, "Oh, well then I'm going to be a poet." And I mean, I didn't even really understand what that meant. But then I had a lot of good fortune. I left this public school where I was very unsafe and not, you know, and I went to this private school. I was a day student at Choate. And in the space of like a year or two, like Donald Hall and Seamus Heaney came and read. And I mean, like really. And so I was like, I spent my whole time at Choate trying not to fail out because I was so unprepared, but for some reason they allowed me to stick around. And like, I heard those two poets read, and I was working, I was six, I guess I must have been my junior year because I was 16, and I was working in a bookstore, library hours bookstore that was like very much going out of business, as Belmont never will. But I was like reading, and what that gave me time to do was like read. And I just started, like I got Donald Hall's book down, and I just started, the way I started reading poetry was I would look at the blurbs and I would read the books of the people who had blurbed like a book, and then I would just go around. And so that was like, by the time I was 13 or 14, I mean, by the time I was like 16, 17, I began to understand like, oh, there were, again, like you, Maya, like, oh, poets are living. There are living poets, and I want to do that. And what would it mean to do that? Yeah. Yeah.
I think a good note to end on would be, who should we be reading that we aren't, and why?
Ooh.
Oh my God.
I love that both of you turned to look at your bookshelves.
And I'm pulling things down.
Lovely. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm gonna just sprint over to my bookshelf 1 second.
I love that impulse that it's a mark of a true book lover is always within reach are the books that you desperately want to show people.
Well, it's also like really interesting because, you know, most of my books are at school and I haven't seen them for like 8 months.
Oh no.
Because of the pandemic. But here are the books that I am living for that are like right near me, and there's a bunch more, but I would say, first of all, and he's in the audience tonight, Tyree Day's book, Cardinal, is just astonishing. And Tyree is with us, I see in the crowd. Hi, Tyree. This book, Cardinal, is phenomenal. It's blowing me away. Joy Priest's book, Horsepower, is incredible. I do believe that this book by Ross Gay, Beholding, is his greatest book yet, and is just like, it's an astonishing book. It's astonishing, Beholding, like really, it's one sentence. I mean, come on. Oliver Bayes Bendorf's The Advantages of Being Evergreen. Somewhere nearby is Zandria Phillips' book, Hull, which is amazing. I can't find it in my shelf right now. And also Lillian Yvonne Bertrand's Travesty Generator. And also I would say Mark Nowak, who is a great figure. That book, Social Poetics, is really, really amazing. Those are some of them.
Yeah, it is so hard to narrow down, but Marwa Halal, yeah, and Aria Aber, Kimone Felix, all of their new books that came out in the last like year or so. I love Kevin Young. I think he's so incredibly good. Just all of his work. Louise Glick, of course, obviously. We were talking about Tommy Blunt tonight. Reginald Dwayne Betts talking about more
Yes.
Warren Wilson people who are amazing. Shane McRae, his like mythology Dante-esque series that he's been doing, and Mark Bibbins, his last book.
I'm obsessed with that book, and I made a real fuss. Like, I mean, who watches me on Twitter? Like 3 people, but like, I made a real fuss. I think that book, new book of his, is extraordinary, and it's insane. It's insane that people are not paying attention to that book.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
I think people don't want to talk about AIDS. That's our next conversation. Like, I think that it's like, that's another night, but I think there's very interesting like that. That's a good list, Maya. Oh, and let me just say.
Oh, of course. Lucille. All day.
And let us say edited by Kevin Young.
Oh, of course.
My first later.
Well, thank you so much for those excellent book lists. Just quick plug, you can find so many of those excellent titles we just listed at belmontbooks.com. And just a quick reminder that up until Thanksgiving, you do get 10% off 3 or more books. Thank you guys so much for being here. It has been such a privilege to listen to both of you talk and read and banter. It's like, I'm very, very excited to have gotten to host this. Thank you to everyone who came. Please check out the rest of our fantastic events at belmontbooks.com. And I hope to see all of you guys soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great rest of your night, you guys.
Thank you so much, everyone. And hey, Maya, I mean, every minute in a room with you is a privilege. And in the world, I hope you have a great time watching a play tonight. And I'm so thankful that we got to talk. More soon.
I am too. And thank you everyone too for coming. This has been so much fun.
Yeah. Have the best night, everyone. Yeah, stay safe. Maya, what does it mean to go to a theater show right now? Does it mean like you turn this off and turn something else on?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do.
I love that. Do you like eat popcorn at home like when you're watching a show? Like, do you have like things that you put in front of yourself to watch a show?
No.
No.
Well, on that note, Maya, we'll have to let you go. Have fun with your show and have a great rest of your night, everybody. Thank you again so much for coming.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See you later.